There is a particular quality to afternoon light that cannot be found at any other time of day. It moves differently through windows, softer than morning brightness, warmer than the thin rays of evening. It is the light of pause, of breath between the day's urgencies and the night's rest. In a kitchen not far from where you might imagine, this light is filtering through lace curtains, casting delicate shadows that dance across worn wooden countertops, patterns that shift and sway with the gentlest movement of air. The room itself seems to be breathing slowly, peacefully, as if it has learned the rhythm of restful living over many quiet years. This is a space that knows comfort. Every surface tells a story of use and care. The smooth hollow in the cutting board, where countless vegetables have been chopped, the slight discoloration on the wall near the stove where steam has kissed the paint 1,000 times, the collection of ceramic bowls in soft blues and creams that nest together on open shelves like a family gathered close. The floor, made of wide planks that have weathered to a soft honey color, creaks in friendly places, announcing your presence not as an intrusion, but as a welcome return. There is no rush here, no demand. Time moves as it should, measured not by the ticking of clocks, but by the way sunlight travels across the room inch by patient inch. The air itself is layered with scents that speak of memory and gentleness. There is the faint vanilla sweetness that lives in old wood, the clean smell of recently washed cotton dish towels hanging near the sink, and beneath it all, something indefinable but unmistakable, the scent of a place that has been loved, not with grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but with the steady accumulating presence of someone who found peace in this very room, who stood at this counter on countless ordinary days and created small moments of grace. The temperature is perfect, neither warm nor cool, but that ideal point where you forget about your body entirely and simply exist as awareness, as presence, as breath. Through the window above the sink, you can see the suggestions of a garden, the blur of green leaves moving lazily, the bright punctuation of yellow flowers nodding in a breeze too gentle to be felt inside. A bee drifts past, its journey unhurried, following some ancient map written in pollen and sunlight. Beyond the garden, the world continues in its own way, but here, in this kitchen, there is only stillness and the promise of something simple and sweet. The silence is not empty, but full, rich with potential, like the moment before the first note of a familiar song begins to play. This is where we will rest together for a while. This is where time will slow even further, where the simple act of following a recipe will become a meditation, a prayer of butter and flour and lemon. Let yourself settle into this light, into this gentle room. Let your shoulders drop, your breath deepen. Everything that needs doing can wait. Everything that worried you an hour ago has no place here. We are going to bake a cake, you and I, and in the baking we will find a peace that asks nothing of us but our quiet attention. Let us wander together through this afternoon, through flour and memory, through the soft, scripted letters of a recipe written long ago. Here there are no demands, no urgencies waiting beyond the next moment. There is only the gentle unfolding of simple steps, each one a small gift of presence. Find a comfortable place. Let your body sink into whatever surface holds you. Close your eyes if you wish, or let them rest half open, softly focused on nothing in particular. The story we are about to enter is a place of quiet comfort, a sanctuary made of ordinary ingredients and extraordinary care. If you would like to find your way back to our peaceful library for more gentle journeys like this one, a soft tap on the subscribe button will ensure a new story is always here, waiting to welcome you home. And now, let us turn the page together and step into this kitchen, into this moment, into the beginning of something sweet and simple. Thomas arrived at the house just as the afternoon was settling into its warmest hour. He is a man of 43 years, though in this moment he feels both much younger and somehow ageless, as if entering this space has lifted the weight of linear time from his shoulders. He moved through the front door with a key that still fit perfectly after all these years, the lock turning with the same soft click he remembered from childhood, and the sound alone was enough to ease something in his chest that he had not realized was tight. He is not a man given to large expressions of emotion. Those who know him would describe him as steady, thoughtful, the kind of person who listens more than he speaks and notices details others might overlook. Today he wears simple clothes, soft cotton trousers the color of sand, a shirt that has been washed so many times it feels like air against his skin. His feet are bare, and as he walks across the kitchen floor, he feels the familiar texture of the wood, the slight coolness of it, the way certain boards give just a little under his weight. These sensations are not new, but they feel newly precious, as if he is touching them for the first time, while simultaneously remembering every other time he has walked this path. The house belongs to him now, left to him when his grandmother passed nearly 2 years ago. It had taken him this long to return, not from grief exactly, but from a kind of reverence. He wanted to be ready to enter this space without sadness, to honor what it had been when she was here, a place of warmth and gentle rhythms where hurry never lived, and worry was always invited to sit down and have tea until it dissolved into something more manageable. Today felt like the right day. The world outside had no claim on him. His work was finished for the week, his obligations met. His phone turned to silent and tucked into a drawer in another room. He had given himself this gift. An afternoon of no purpose beyond being present in this kitchen that had always felt like the heart of something important. Thomas moved slowly through the space, his hands trailing along the counter's edge, pausing at the stove where a kettle still sat on the back burner, its copper bottom darkened by years of flame. He opened a cabinet and found the familiar collection of mismatched plates, each one a memory, the blue one with tiny white flowers from which he had eaten countless slices of toast, the yellow one, slightly chipped, that always held the best cookies. He closed the cabinet gently, reverently, and turned to face the open shelving unit near the window where his grandmother had kept her cookbooks. There were perhaps 20 of them, their spines facing out in no particular order. Some were proper published volumes with glossy covers, others were spiral-bound community collections with titles like Favorite Recipes from Riverside Church or The Garden Club Bakes. But it was the oldest one that caught his attention today, a thick book bound in faded red cloth, its cover soft as skin from decades of handling. He knew this book. As a child, he had watched his grandmother pull it from the shelf more times than he could count, had seen her fingers, bent with age but still graceful, turn its pages with the care one might give to a living thing. He reached for it now, and the weight of it in his hands was immediately grounding, as if the book itself was inviting him to slow down, to pay attention, to remember that the best things are rarely rushed. Thomas carried the cookbook to the kitchen table, the same sturdy wooden table where he had done homework, where he had shelled peas into a bowl every summer, where he had sat on countless Sunday mornings watching his grandmother move through her rituals of feeding and care. He pulled out a chair, its legs scraping softly against the floor with a sound that was pure nostalgia, and sat down. The light from the window fell across the table's surface, illuminating years of small scratches and stains that no amount of cleaning had ever fully erased, nor would anyone want them to. These marks were the record of use, of life, of meals shared, and messes made, and the gentle chaos of a kitchen that had served its purpose well. He placed the cookbook in the center of the table and simply looked at it for a moment. The cloth cover had faded unevenly, darker at the edges where hands had gripped it most often, lighter in the middle where the afternoon sun had touched it during the years it sat on the shelf. There was no title embossed on the front, no author's name. It was simply a book, made personal by decades of use. Thomas ran his hand over the surface, feeling the texture of the fabric, the slight ridge where the binding met the cover. His grandmother's hands had touched this book thousands of times. For a moment, that connection felt almost physical, as if by touching what she had touched, he was reaching across time to hold her hand one more time. With slow deliberation, he opened the cover. The first page was blank except for a date written in pencil in the upper right corner, 1947. The year his grandmother had married and moved into this house, the year this book had presumably come with her as part of her trousseau, as essential as linens or dishes. He turned the page and there was the table of contents, handwritten in careful script. Breads, vegetables, main dishes, desserts, preserves, each section marked with a page number that had been updated multiple times as recipes were added, and the book swelled beyond its original organization. Thomas turned pages slowly, in no hurry to arrive anywhere in particular. He passed recipes for pot roast and chicken stew, for pickled beets and corn relish. Many pages bore stains, a splash of grease here, a smudge of flour there, a rusty spot that might have been tomato sauce or berry juice. These marks did not diminish the book, but enhanced it, transforming it from mere information into artifact, into proof that these recipes had been lived, not just read. Some pages had small annotations in the margins. Next to a recipe for bread and butter pickles, his grandmother had written in tiny letters, "Made 12 quarts, summer of '59, cucumbers especially good that year." Next to a recipe for beef stew, add extra carrots. Thomas prefers them to potatoes. His name, written in her hand, made him smile. He had forgotten that he had preferred carrots, but seeing it written there, he could suddenly taste them, sweet and tender, soaked in rich gravy. He continued turning pages, moving through the seasons of food, through decades of meals. And then, about 2/3 of the way through the book, tucked between a recipe for apple brown Betty and another for chocolate pudding cake, he found something that made him pause. It was a card, slightly smaller than the page, made of thick cream-colored paper that had yellowed gently with age. The edges were soft and slightly fuzzy, the way paper gets when it has been handled with care for many years. On it, in his grandmother's unmistakable handwriting, written in ink that had faded from blue to something closer to grey, was a recipe. The title, underlined once, read, "Simple lemon cake for quiet afternoons." Thomas lifted the card from the book carefully, as if it might dissolve at rough handling. It was heavier than he expected, the paper of a quality that is rarely made anymore. He held it up to the light, and could see the slight texture of the paper's weave, could see how the ink had settled into the fibers, becoming part of the card itself rather than just sitting on its surface. The handwriting was his grandmother's from earlier in her life, he thought. The letters were more confident, more flowing than the slightly shakier script of her later years. He imagined her as a younger woman, perhaps newly married, sitting at this very table and copying this recipe from somewhere, or perhaps creating it herself, working out proportions and methods until they felt right. He set the card down gently on the table and read through the recipe slowly. It was remarkably simple, as the title promised. Butter, sugar, eggs, flour, milk, lemons, baking powder, salt. Nothing exotic, nothing that required special trips or particular skill. The instructions were equally straightforward. Cream butter and sugar, add eggs one at a time, fold in dry ingredients alternately with milk, add lemon zest and juice, bake until golden. At the bottom of the card, in the same faded blue ink, there was a small note. "This cake asks nothing of you but attention. Give it that, and it will give you peace." Thomas read that line again, and something in him settled even further. This cake asks nothing of you but attention. In that moment it felt like the most profound instruction he had ever received. Not a demand for perfection or complexity, just attention, just presence. He could give that. Today, in this kitchen filled with gentle light and gentler memories, he could absolutely give that. He stood from the table, the card held carefully in his hand, and moved to the counter. He would make this cake. He would follow these faded instructions, and in doing so he would spend an afternoon with his grandmother, not in sorrow for her absence, but in gratitude for what she had left behind. Thomas began by gathering ingredients, and even this simple act became a meditation. He moved through the kitchen with unhurried purpose, opening cabinets and drawers that responded with familiar sounds. The cabinet where the flour lived creaked slightly on its hinge, a sound he had heard 10,000 times. Inside, the flour sat in a large glass jar with a metal clasp, the same jar that had held flour for as long as he could remember. He lifted it down, feeling its weight, seeing how the flour inside had settled, creating subtle layers like sediment in stone. Some of the flour near the glass had a faint golden tinge from wheat germ, while the flour in the center was pure white. He set the jar on the counter with care, the glass making a soft sound against the wood. The sugar lived in a matching jar beside where the flour had been. He brought it down and placed it next to the flour, the two jars catching the light, the crystals inside sparkling faintly. There was something deeply satisfying about these jars, about the way the ingredients were visible through clear glass, about the honest simplicity of knowing exactly what was what. No plastic packages, no printed labels, just flour and sugar in glass, the way it had been kept in this kitchen for generations. He found himself standing still for a moment, just looking at these two jars, feeling an unexpected surge of affection for them, for the way they represented continuity and care. The eggs were in the refrigerator, sitting in a ceramic holder shaped like a hen, a whimsical piece that his grandmother had always used. He lifted out 3 eggs, each one smooth and cool in his palm. He had brought these from his own apartment, but holding them here they felt different. as if the kitchen itself was transforming even these ordinary objects into something worthy of attention. He placed them on the counter beside the jars, arranging them in a small triangle, and noticed how the light fell across their shells, creating tiny shadows that changed as he moved. The lemons required a moment of searching. He found them in a wooden bowl on the windowsill, a place he remembered as being constantly filled with whatever fruit was in season. Today there were 4 lemons, their skins bright yellow against the dark wood of the bowl. He picked one up and immediately brought it to his nose. The scent was there, faint on the skin, a promise of the brightness held inside. He selected 3 of the lemons, the ones that felt heaviest for their size, full of juice and potential. As he held them, he remembered something his grandmother had once told him. Lemons hold sunshine even in winter. At the time, he had thought it was just a pretty thing to say, but now, standing in this warm kitchen with the weight of the lemons in his hands, he understood it differently. They did hold light. They held brightness and sharpness and life. He returned to the refrigerator for butter and milk. The butter was in a covered ceramic dish, another piece that had lived in this kitchen forever. He lifted the lid and found a fresh block, which he had brought yesterday when he decided to come for the weekend. The butter was pale yellow, the color of early morning light. The milk in a glass bottle was cold in his hands, and he could see tiny beads of condensation forming on the outside as it met the warmer air. He set these items with the others, and now the counter was beginning to look purposeful, like an artist's palette before the painting begins. The recipe card, which he had propped against the flour jar, called for vanilla, though it specified just a whisper. He found the vanilla in a small amber bottle in the spice cabinet, and when he opened it, the smell that emerged was rich and sweet and complex, everything a whisper should not be. And yet somehow, in the context of baking, he understood exactly what his grandmother had meant. A whisper, not too much, just enough to know it is there. He set the vanilla beside the lemons. From a lower cabinet, he pulled out the mixing bowls, a large one in pale blue for the batter, a smaller one in cream for the dry ingredients. These bowls had been here since before he was born. His grandmother had received them as a wedding gift, according to a story he had been told once. They had cradled countless batters, doughs, salads, and mixtures over the decades. They had been heated and cooled, had survived drops and bumps, had earned their small chips and crazing lines. Thomas ran his fingers around the rim of the blue bowl, feeling its familiar shape. There was something profound about using these bowls to make this recipe, about repeating a ritual with the same tools that had been used before. It was continuity. It was honoring. With a clean dish towel, he wiped down the counter, clearing a space for his work. The towel was soft from many washings, and it smelled like the lavender sachet his grandmother had always kept in the linen drawer. Even this small detail, the scent of lavender rising as he moved the cloth across the counter, was part of the ritual, part of the gentle accumulation of sensory moments that were transforming this afternoon into something outside of ordinary time. He measured flour first, using the old metal scoop that nested inside the flour jar. The recipe called for 2 cups, and he scooped carefully, overfilling the measuring cup, and then using the straight edge of a butter knife to level it off. The excess flour fell back into the jar with a soft whisper of sound. He did this twice, watching the flour fall in a pale cascade, seeing the way individual particles caught the light as they tumbled. Into the cream-colored bowl it went, creating a small white mountain with slopes and valleys. Next came the baking powder, 2 teaspoons, measured with care. The powder was finer than the flour, more compact, and it smelled faintly of metal and magic, the alchemy that would make this cake rise. He added it to the flour, then the salt, 1/2 teaspoon, the crystals glittering like tiny diamonds as he sprinkled them in. He set this bowl aside. These dry ingredients would wait patiently for their moment. Now came the butter. The recipe specified room temperature, and Thomas had had the foresight to leave it out for an hour. It was soft now, yielding when he pressed his finger against it, but not melted, not oily. Perfect. He cut the butter into chunks and placed them in the blue bowl, and even this small act was satisfying. The knife sliding through the butter with just a little resistance, the neat cubes that resulted, each one about the same size. His grandmother would have approved of this care. She had always said that baking was about respect. Respecting the ingredients, respecting the process, respecting the person who would eventually eat what you made. He measured sugar, 1½ cups of white crystals that poured with a sound like distant rain. The sugar joined the butter in the blue bowl, And now came a step that the recipe described simply as cream together until light and fluffy, until the butter becomes pale and full of air, until your arm is pleasantly tired and your mind is pleasantly empty. He had to smile at that. It was such a grandmother thing to say, to acknowledge that the work itself was part of the gift. He began to cream the butter and sugar together, using a wooden spoon that was nearly as old as the house itself. The handle was smooth from decades of hands, slightly darker where fingers had gripped it most often. At first the sugar and butter were distinct, the crystals clearly visible against the yellow of the butter. But as he stirred, as he pressed the mixture against the side of the bowl and folded it over and over, they began to merge. The butter softened further under the friction, and the sugar began to dissolve, its sharp edges smoothing. The mixture grew paler, shifting from the pale yellow of butter towards something closer to cream, to clouds, to the color of possibility. The motion was rhythmic, circular, hypnotic, around and around, pressing and folding. And as he worked, Thomas found his breathing synchronizing with the movement. Inhale as the spoon went down, exhale as it came up. The small sounds filled the kitchen, the soft scrape of wood against ceramic, the slight whisper of the mixture as it folded over itself, the occasional breath he took that was slightly deeper than the last. His shoulder began to feel the work, a pleasant warmth spreading through the muscle. His mind, which had been full of thoughts when he arrived, began to empty, until there was only this, the motion, the mixing, the gradual transformation happening in the bowl. After what might have been 5 minutes or 15, time having lost its usual markers, the mixture was indeed light and fluffy. When he lifted the spoon, the butter and sugar clung to it in soft peaks that held their shape for a moment before slowly collapsing. It had doubled in volume, become pale and airy, and there was something beautiful about it, about the way such simple ingredients could be transformed through nothing more than attention and effort. The eggs came next. He cracked the first one on the edge of the bowl, a gentle tap that created a clean break. The shell parted and the egg slid out, the yolk a perfect golden sphere suspended in the clear white. He watched it for a moment before stirring it in, watching the yellow break and begin to swirl into the pale mixture. The recipe specified 1 egg at a time, beaten well after each addition, and so he stirred, working the egg completely into the butter and sugar before reaching for the next. The second egg, then the third, each one transforming the mixture further. With each addition, the batter became glossier, more cohesive, taking on a yellow glow that seemed to hold its own light. The vanilla came next. Just a whisper, as the recipe promised. He poured a small amount into a teaspoon, then drizzled it into the batter. The scent rose immediately, sweet and warm and infinitely comforting. He stirred it in, and the fragrance spread through the kitchen, mingling with the buttery sweetness already present, creating something that smelled like every good thing he had ever associated with this house. Now came the lemons, and this step required attention of a different kind. He took the first lemon and rolled it on the counter, pressing down with the palm of his hand. This was a trick his grandmother had taught him, rolling the lemon breaks down the membranes inside, making it easier to juice, making it give up its treasure more willingly. The lemon rolled smoothly under his palm, and he could feel it softening slightly, becoming more pliable. He did this with all 3 lemons, taking his time, enjoying the simple motion, the way the bright yellow fruit moved across the honey-colored wood. For the zest, he pulled out a small metal tool with sharp holes, a zester that had hung in the same spot on the kitchen wall for as long as he could remember. He held the lemon in one hand and the zester in the other, and began to scrape gently along the lemon skin. Tiny curls of yellow zest began to accumulate in a small pile, and with them came a smell that was almost shockingly bright. It was sharp and clean and impossibly fresh, cutting through all the other scents in the kitchen, claiming space. This was the sunshine his grandmother had spoken of, concentrated and intense. He zested 2 of the lemons, creating a small mountain of yellow curls, each one containing oils that would infuse the cake with brightness. He added the zest to the batter and stirred it in, watching the yellow specks disperse throughout the mixture, seeing them catch the light. The smell was now fully integrated into the kitchen's atmosphere, transforming the space into something even more special, even more apart from the ordinary world. Juicing the lemons required a simple glass reamer, another tool that had lived in the same drawer for decades. He cut the first lemon in half, and the knife went through with a satisfying resistance, the flesh parting to reveal the segmented interior, glistening with juice. He placed one half on the reamer and pressed, twisting slightly. The juice began to flow immediately, dripping down into the small bowl beneath, and with it came more of that incredible scent. He pressed and twisted, getting as much juice as possible, watching the lemon half collapse under the pressure, its work done, its gift given. He did this with all 3 lemons, and when he was finished he had nearly half a cup of juice, pale yellow and slightly cloudy, with a few seeds floating on the surface. He strained out the seeds with his fingers, flicking them into the sink, then set the bowl of juice aside. The recipe called for adding the dry ingredients and the milk alternately, beginning and ending with the dry ingredients. This was classic baking technique, ensuring even mixing and proper texture. Thomas measured the milk, 3/4 of a cup, poured into a small glass measuring cup. The milk was white and slightly thick, its surface catching the light. He looked at the recipe card again, reading his grandmother's words. Add dry ingredients and milk alternately, stirring gently after each addition. Do not beat. Let the batter come together in its own time. There is no hurry in a cake made for a quiet afternoon. He added 1/3 of the flour mixture to the batter and stirred gently with the wooden spoon. The flour sat on top of the wet mixture for a moment, pale and powdery, before he began to fold it in. The batter resisted at first, clumping and turning shaggy, but as he continued to stir with a light hand, it began to relax, to accept the flour, to become smooth again. When no streaks of flour remained, he added half the milk. It pooled on the surface of the batter, white against yellow before being stirred in. The batter thinned slightly, becoming more fluid. Another 1/3 of the flour, more stirring. The batter thickening again. The rest of the milk, the batter loosening. The final portion of flour, and then the patient stirring until everything was combined into a single unified mixture that was thick but pourable, smooth but with a pleasant heaviness that spoke of the butter and eggs within it. Finally, the lemon juice. The recipe specified adding it last, and as Thomas poured it in, he watched the pale yellow liquid swirl into the batter, creating momentary ribbons before being incorporated. He stirred gently, just until combined, and the batter took on its final form. Pale yellow, glossy, smooth, smelling of butter and sugar and lemon and vanilla and promise. He lifted the spoon and let the batter fall back into the bowl, watching how it ribboned off the spoon, how it slowly settled back into itself. It was perfect. It was ready. As Thomas reached for the cake pan that sat on the shelf below the counter, something caught his eye. The recipe card, which he had been reading and rereading, seemed to have more writing on it than he had initially noticed. He set down the wooden spoon and picked up the card again, holding it closer, angling it toward the light. And there, along the margins, written in an even fainter ink than the recipe itself, were small annotations that he had missed before. On the left margin, running vertically up the side, his grandmother had written, "Made this on rainy Sundays, when the house felt too quiet." The cake always helped. The writing was tiny, cramped into the narrow space, but unmistakably hers. Thomas felt something catch in his chest. He had not known that she had felt the house to be too quiet, had not known that she had needed help in the way this note suggested, but of course she had. After his grandfather passed, she had lived here alone for 15 years. There must have been many quiet Sundays, many afternoons when the silence pressed in, and she had made this cake, this simple, bright cake that asked nothing but attention. Along the bottom margin, just below the final instruction, there was another note. Add extra lemon when the garden is blooming, when the bees are drunk with pollen and the whole world smells like growth. Made with less sugar after doctor's visit in 73, still good. Sweetness is not only in sugar. Thomas smiled at this, at the practical adjustment, at the poetry of bees drunk with pollen, at the philosophy that sweetness comes from more than sugar. Of course it does. Sweetness comes from attention, from care, from the act of making something with love. But it was the note on the right margin that made Thomas have to sit down for a moment, that made him pull out the kitchen chair and lower himself into it while still holding the card. This note was in a slightly shakier hand, written perhaps later in her life, and it said simply, "Thomas always liked this cake best. He never knew that I made it on days when I missed him most, when the house felt empty of children's voices. The cake kept my hands busy and my heart full. He is a good boy. I hope he remembers to be gentle with himself." Thomas sat very still, the card held carefully in both hands, reading those words again and again. He never knew, and he had not known. Had not known that this specific cake was connected to him, had not known that she made it when she missed him. He thought of all the times he had eaten this cake as a child, as a teenager, as a young adult visiting from college or from his first apartment. It had always been there, appearing casually, as if she had just happened to make it. But it had not been casual at all. It had been intentional. It had been love translated into flour and eggs and lemon. And that last line, I hope he remembers to be gentle with himself. Even in her private notes, in words she may have never expected him to see, she was taking care of him, reminding him, hoping for him. He felt his eyes sting slightly, but it was not a sad feeling. It was overwhelming in its sweetness, in its unexpected gift. Here, tucked into the margins of a recipe, was a message from his grandmother, delivered years after her death, reminding him to be gentle with himself on a day when he had not realized he needed that reminder. He stood up carefully, as if sudden movement might disturb something precious in the air around him. He placed the recipe card back against the flour jar, positioning it so he could still read the instructions, but now also so he could see the marginalia, these small gifts written in faded ink. He looked at the batter waiting in the bowl, and it seemed different now. This was not just a cake, this was a conversation across time. This was his grandmother's hands reaching out to hold his. This was love that had outlasted life itself, preserved in the simple act of writing down a recipe and noting in tiny letters that this was for the days when hearts needed filling. Thomas stood at the counter, and for a moment he simply breathed. The kitchen was still warm with afternoon light. The batter still waited patiently. The lemons still perfumed the air. But now there was something more. There was presence. Not the unsettling presence of grief or loss, but the comforting presence of continuity, of connection, of being part of a story that was longer than his own life. His grandmother had stood in this very spot, had made this very cake, had thought of him, and now he was here making it again, thinking of her. The circle was complete and unbroken. He picked up the cake pan, a simple round pan made of metal that had darkened slightly over years of use. He would prepare this pan, pour in this batter, bake this cake, and in doing so, he would be answering her, even though she could not hear. He would be saying, I received your message, I will be gentle with myself. I will make this cake on quiet afternoons. I will remember. Thank you for loving me in all the ways you knew how, including this one, this recipe written in faded ink that has become one of the most precious things I have ever held. Thomas prepared the pan with care, buttering the bottom and sides with a paper towel dipped in soft butter, then dusting it lightly with flour. He tapped out the excess flour over the sink, watching the white powder fall like snow, and set the pan on the counter. It was ready to receive the batter, and he was ready to give it. He poured the batter slowly, tilting the bowl and guiding the thick mixture into the pan. It flowed heavily, golden and glossy, and he used a spatula to scrape the last bits from the bowl, not wanting to waste even a spoonful of this batter that had come to mean so much. The pan was filled about 2/3 full, exactly right for a cake that would rise and dome gently in the oven's heat. He lifted the pan slightly and tapped it gently on the counter, once, twice, allowing any air bubbles to rise to the surface and pop. The batter settled into itself, smoothing its own surface, becoming level. The oven had been heating while he mixed, and it was ready now, its interior warm and waiting. And Thomas opened the oven door, feeling the wave of heat that emerged, carrying with it the faint smell of previous bakings, of 1,000 cakes and casseroles and roasts that had come before this one. He slid the pan onto the center rack, positioning it carefully so it sat level, so the heat would reach it evenly from all sides. He closed the door slowly, gently, as if the cake were already a living thing that could be startled by sudden movements. Through the oven's window, he could see the pan sitting in the golden interior, the batter still and waiting. He set the timer, the old mechanical kind that ticked audibly for 35 minutes. The recipe had said 35 to 40 minutes, until a toothpick inserted in the center comes out clean, until the top is golden and springs back lightly when touched. He would check it at 35, would trust the cake to tell him when it was ready. And now came the waiting, which was perhaps the most important part of all. Thomas looked around the kitchen, at the mixing bowls that needed washing, at the counter that needed wiping, but he found he did not want to do those things yet. The mess, such as it was, felt like proof of what had happened here, evidence of the ritual. To clean it away too quickly would be to erase something that deserved to linger. Instead, he moved to the kitchen table and sat down in the same chair he had occupied earlier, the same chair from which he had discovered the recipe card with its hidden messages. The recipe card was still propped against the flour jar on the counter, but he could see it from here, could see the faded blue ink, could imagine the words he now knew were hidden in the margins. The kitchen was warm, not uncomfortably so, but with the gentle warmth that comes from an oven doing its work, from the ongoing transformation happening behind the closed door. Thomas folded his hands on the table's surface and simply sat. There was nothing that needed doing in this moment. The cake would bake in its own time. The timer would ring when it was ready. Until then, his only task was to be present, to occupy this space, to allow the afternoon to unfold at its own pace. He found that his breathing had slowed without him realizing it, that his shoulders had dropped, that his jaw had unclenched. The act of making the cake had been meditative, but the waiting, was equally so, perhaps more so. In a world that always demanded the next thing, the next task, the next achievement, there was something revolutionary about sitting still and waiting for a cake to bake. Through the window, he could see that the afternoon light had shifted slightly. It came from a lower angle now, creating longer shadows, making the green of the garden outside more golden. A bird landed on the windowsill, a small brown sparrow, and it tilted its head, looking into the kitchen with one bright eye. Thomas watched it, and the bird watched him, and there was a moment of perfect mutual observation before the bird hopped away, returning to its own afternoon tasks. The simplicity of that exchange, the pure presence of it, made Thomas smile. He realized that he had not thought about work in over an hour, had not thought about the emails waiting in his inbox, the project deadlines approaching, the small professional anxieties that usually filled the background of his mind like static. They had not disappeared exactly, but they had been put in their proper perspective. They would be there tomorrow. They would be handled in their time. But right now in this kitchen, with a cake baking and the smell of lemon beginning to perfume the air more strongly, none of those things could touch him. He was protected by the simplicity of this moment, by the act of honoring a recipe and the woman who had written it. The sound of the oven was very soft, just the occasional click of the heating element, the whisper of hot air circulating. But gradually, beneath those mechanical sounds, another sound began to emerge. It was so faint at first that Thomas was not sure he was really hearing it. A gentle bubbling, the sound of the cake's batter heating, its edges beginning to set, its center beginning to rise. It was a sound of transformation, of potential becoming actual, of ingredients becoming something more than the sum of their parts. He closed his eyes and listened to it, this smallest of sounds that somehow contained all the magic of baking. The scent was growing stronger now. What had been the bright sharpness of lemon zest and juice was beginning to mellow, to blend with the sweetness of the sugar and the richness of the butter. The vanilla, which had been present but subtle, was emerging more clearly as the heat brought out its complexity. And beneath it all was the fundamental smell of baking, of flour and eggs turning golden, of proteins changing structure, of starches gelatinizing, of the Maillard reaction creating hundreds of new flavor compounds that had not existed before. It was the smell of alchemy, of kitchen magic, of love made tangible. Thomas opened his eyes and looked around the kitchen again, seeing it with fresh attention. Every object seemed to glow with significance. The blue ceramic bowl still holding the remnants of batter, a film of yellow coating its sides. The wooden spoon resting across the bowl, its handle darkened where his hand had gripped it. The lemon halves, turned inside out and exhausted, sitting near the sink. The measuring cups and spoons scattered across the counter in the comfortable disorder of work, completed. The flour jar and sugar jar returned to their spots, containing less than they had before, their contents now transformed and transforming in the heat of the oven. This kitchen had witnessed so much, had fed so many people, had been the site of so many ordinary miracles, and it was still doing that work even now, even with his grandmother gone. The room itself seemed to hold memory, seemed to be able to pass on its lessons to whoever was willing to slow down and pay attention. Thomas felt intensely grateful to be here, to be part of this continuity, to be one more person in a long line of people who had stood at this counter and made something with their hands and offered it to others or to themselves. The timer ticked steadily, marking time in its mechanical way, but time itself felt different here. It was not pressing or urgent. It was simply flowing, like a gentle stream, carrying him along at a pace that felt right and true. He thought about what his grandmother had written. "This cake asks nothing of you but attention." He had given it attention. The cake was giving him peace in return. The bargain had been fair and true. He stood and moved to the oven, not to open it, but just to look through its window. Inside, he could see that the batter had risen, was rising still, transforming from liquid to solid, from raw to cooked. The edges were beginning to pull away from the pan slightly, and the center was domed pale gold in the oven's light. It was not ready yet, but it was becoming. He watched it for a long moment, this quiet miracle, and then returned to his chair. The waiting was not empty. It was full of scent and light and memory and presence, full of the ticking of the timer and the sound of the oven and the occasional creak of the house settling around him, full of the knowledge that in just a little while there would be cake, golden and tender and bright with lemon, a cake made from a recipe written in faded ink, a cake that connected him to his grandmother and to every person who had ever made something simple and good and offered it to the world. The timer rang, its bell cutting through the peaceful silence with a gentle insistence. Thomas stood and moved to the oven, and as he did, the smell intensified, rolling out to meet him like a greeting. It was the smell of completion, of something that had finished its transformation and was ready to be revealed. He turned off the timer, silencing it, and opened the oven door. Heat billowed out, carrying with it the full force of the scent, and Thomas had to close his eyes for a moment against the rush of it. When he opened them, he looked down at the cake, and it was beautiful. The top had turned a perfect golden brown, deeper at the edges, lighter in the center. The surface had a slight sheen from the butter in the batter, and he could see tiny flecks of lemon zest scattered across the top like tiny yellow stars. The cake had risen well, creating a gentle dome that suggested tenderness within. He reached for a toothpick from the small ceramic holder on the counter and inserted it gently into the center of the cake. When he pulled it out, it emerged clean, with just the faintest crumbs clinging to it. Perfect. The cake was done, had told him so in its own language. He pulled on the oven mitts that hung on a hook near the stove, mitts that were faded and quilted and had protected hands in this kitchen for decades. He gripped the hot pan carefully and lifted it from the oven, transferring it to a cooling rack on the counter. The cake sat in its pan, radiating heat, its surface still rising and falling almost imperceptibly as the last of its internal reactions completed themselves. Steam rose from it in gentle waves, visible in the slanting afternoon light, carrying scent and heat upward to dissipate in the kitchen's warm air. Thomas closed the oven door and turned it off, then stood looking down at the cake, his hands still covered by the mitts, feeling a sense of accomplishment that was entirely disproportionate to the simplicity of what he had done. He had followed a recipe. He had measured and mixed and poured. He had waited. And yet it felt enormous, this simple cake. It felt like an act of connection, of defiance against forgetting, of love expressed in the most fundamental way, by making something to share, even if the person you most wanted to share it with was no longer there to receive it. He removed the mitts and placed them back on their hook. The recipe card suggested letting the cake cool in the pan for 10 minutes before turning it out onto a plate. 10 more minutes of waiting. But this waiting was different. The active work was done. The transformation was complete. Now there was only the gentle countdown to the moment when the cake would be revealed in its final form. Thomas moved to the sink and began to wash the mixing bowls, but even this task had become meditation. The warm water from the tap, the slick feel of the bowl's interior as his hand moved around it, wiping away the traces of batter, the way the soap bubbled and foamed, the way the bowl's blue surface emerged clean and bright as the batter washed away. He washed the measuring cups and spoons, the wooden spoon, the small bowl that had held the lemon juice. Each item was cleaned and placed in the drying rack, and with each item, the counter became clearer, more orderly, returning to its state of calm readiness. He wiped down the counter with the same lavender-scented dish towel he had used before, gathering up the small piles of flour, the grains of sugar, the tiny bits of lemon zest that had escaped. The counter gleamed under his attention, and the kitchen was transformed from a space of active work back into a space of peaceful rest. Only the cake remained, still radiating gentle heat from its pan, still perfuming the air with its golden scent. When 10 minutes had passed, measured not by the timer but by some internal clock that seemed to know when the moment was right, Thomas placed a large plate upside down over the pan. He gripped both the plate and the pan firmly, said a small prayer to the baking gods, and flipped the whole thing over in one smooth motion. There was a soft sound, a slight release, and he lifted the pan away. The cake had released perfectly, dropping onto the plate in one piece, its bottom now its top, showing the slightly darker crust that had been against the pan. He looked at it for a moment, then gently flipped it again onto a second plate, so the golden domed top was facing up once more, as it should be. The cake sat on the plate, complete and beautiful in its simplicity. It was not a work of art in the decorative sense. There was no frosting, no elaborate piping, no architectural drama. It was simply a cake, golden and tender, and smelling of lemon and butter and home. But in its simplicity was its perfection. This was exactly what it was meant to be. Nothing more, nothing less. A cake for a quiet afternoon, asking nothing but attention, giving peace in return. Thomas sat down at the table once more, the cake on the counter still visible to him, still present. The kitchen had returned to its state of quiet calm, but it was a different calm now, an earned calm, a calm that came after effort and attention and care. The afternoon light had shifted again, was even more golden, even more gentle. The day was moving toward evening, but slowly, with no hurry, with grace, with no. He simply sat and looked at the cake and breathed, and felt something in his chest that was too complex to be named, but that felt like gratitude and peace, and a kind of wholeness that he had not known he was missing. The cake was there. He was here. His grandmother, though gone, was somehow present in the room, in the recipe, in the cake itself. Time was no longer linear but circular, spiraling, connecting past and present and future, in a way that made all of them exist simultaneously in this one perfect afternoon. The house creaked slightly, settling, the way old houses do. Somewhere outside, the bird he had seen earlier sang a few notes, pure and clear. The refrigerator hummed its low, steady song. And in the middle of it all, on a plate on the counter, a lemon cake cooled, completing its journey from ingredients to memory to love made visible. Thomas closed his eyes and let himself simply exist in this moment, this perfect moment, where nothing was wanted and nothing was lacking, where everything was exactly as it should be, where the simple act of making a cake had become a prayer, an offering, a bridge between the living and the dead, between the past and the present, between loneliness and connection. His breathing was slow and deep, his body completely relaxed, his mind quiet and clear. This was peace. This was home. This was the gift his grandmother had tried to teach him all those years, written in faded ink on a recipe card, waiting for the moment when he would be ready to receive it. The gift of attention, the gift of simplicity, the gift of being present to the small, ordinary miracles that fill every day, if only we slow down enough to notice them. The gift of knowing that love does not end when life does, but continues, preserved in recipes and rituals, and the patient teaching of how to be gentle with ourselves. The cake sat cooling as the afternoon slipped gently toward evening. The light in the kitchen had turned from gold to amber, the sun dropping lower beyond the window, stretching the shadows long and soft across the floor. Thomas remained at the table, his hands resting on its surface, feeling no need to move, no need to do anything but be present to this moment as it slowly transformed into the next. He thought about cutting into the cake, about tasting the result of his afternoon's work, but found that he was not quite ready. There was something perfect about the cake as it was now, complete and whole, sitting on the plate in all its simple glory. To cut it would be to begin its ending, and he wanted to live in this space just a little longer, in the after moment, in the peace that follows completion. The kitchen was growing dimmer, not dark, but softer, the light becoming gentler and more forgiving. Thomas stood slowly, his chair scraping softly against the floor, and moved to the window. Outside, the garden was settling into its evening colors, the greens deepening, the flowers closing their petals in preparation for night. The sky above was beginning to show the first hints of pink and lavender, the promise of sunset still an hour or so away, but approaching, always approaching. He turned back to look at the kitchen, seeing it now as if for the first time, or perhaps as if for the last time, with the kind of attention we give to things when we know we must remember them. The blue bowls in the drying rack, the recipe card still propped against the flour jar, its faded ink holding so much more than instructions, the wooden spoon washed and resting, the lemon cake on its plate, cooling, waiting, all of it bathed in this amber light, all of it peaceful, all of it exactly right. He moved to the cake and placed his hand near it, not touching, just feeling the gentle warmth that still radiated from it. It had given up most of its heat now, was approaching room temperature, was settling into its final form. In a little while he would cut a piece, would taste what he had made, would complete the circle, but not yet, not quite yet. Thomas gathered the recipe card from the counter, handling it with the reverence it deserved, and returned it carefully to the cookbook, placing it back between the pages where he had found it, between the apple-brown Betty and the chocolate pudding cake. The card settled into its familiar groove, the pages closing around it like a protective embrace. He closed the cookbook and held it for a moment, feeling its weight, its history, its love. Then he returned it to the shelf where it lived, sliding it back into its place among the other volumes. The kitchen was quiet now, the kind of quiet that is not empty but full, pregnant with meaning and memory. Thomas moved through it slowly, turning on a small lamp near the table, its soft glow pushing back the gathering dimness just enough. The cake glowed in the lamplight, golden and perfect. He stood looking at it, and he felt his grandmother's presence so strongly in that moment that he almost turned around, expecting to see her standing there, smiling at him with that gentle smile that had always made him feel safe and seen and loved. But of course she was not there, not in body, and yet she was there, in the cake, in the recipe, in the kitchen itself, in the lessons she had taught him about slowing down, about paying attention, about being gentle with himself, in the way she had loved him, not with grand gestures, but with the steady accumulation of small acts of care. A cake made when she missed him, a recipe written down, a note in the margin hoping he would remember to be kind to himself. He had received her message, had heard it across time and distance and the boundary between life and death, and he would carry it with him, would return to this kitchen when he needed reminding, would make this cake on quiet afternoons when the world felt too loud or his heart felt too heavy. He would follow the recipe written in faded ink, and in following it he would remember. He would be gentle with himself. He would pay attention to the small miracles. He would know that he was loved, had been loved, would continue to be loved in ways that transcended presence and absence. The day was ending. The cake was made. The kitchen was clean. And Thomas was at peace, standing in the amber light, breathing slowly, feeling full in a way that had nothing to do with food and everything to do with connection, with meaning, with the simple, profound gift of being alive and being loved, and being able to receive that love even when the giver was gone. Outside, the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Inside, the lamp cast its gentle glow, and in the space between, in the kitchen where so much life had been lived, a man stood beside a lemon cake and felt, perhaps for the first time in a very long time, that everything was going to be all right, that he was exactly where he needed to be, that this moment, this simple, quiet moment was enough, more than enough. It was everything. The story of the afternoon has now drawn to its close. The cake is made. The recipe has been honored. The connection has been felt and held and treasured. In this kitchen, in this fading light, a small act of love has been completed, and in its completion something has been healed, something has been remembered, something has been passed on. If you are still with me in this quiet moment, if you have traveled through this afternoon and found some measure of peace in the simple act of making a cake, then the story has done its work. I hope it has brought you tranquility, has slowed your breathing, has given you permission to rest. For those of you still listening, still here in this gentle space between waking and sleep, a quiet like helps our stories find others who might need a moment of peace. And if you choose to subscribe, our little collection of quiet tales will be here waiting for you whenever you need to find your way back to stillness. Thank you for letting me read to you tonight. Thank you for giving me your attention, for walking with me through this kitchen, for allowing yourself to slow down and be present to the small magic of flour and eggs and lemon and love. May you carry some of this peace with you into your sleep. May you remember to be gentle with yourself. May you find your own recipes written in faded ink, your own connections that transcend time, your own quiet afternoons where the world falls away and only the essential remains. The lamp in the kitchen will stay lit for a while longer. The cake will sit on its plate, waiting. And when you are ready, when you need to return, this story will be here, patient and unchanging, ready to welcome you home. Sleep well. Rest deeply. You are loved. Good night.